Hello and welcome to today's 3-Day Friday talk show. I'm Michael Petch, I'm your host today, and I'm the editor-in-chief of 3dprintingindustry.com, which is where you may know me from. Today's topic is additive manufacturing in the oil and gas industry, with a specific focus on moving from the physical to digital warehouse. And our guests today are additive manufacturing experts, running and working enterprises active at a range of value chain stages in what is a $86 trillion oil and gas sector. So there'll be plenty of opportunities to ask our guests questions throughout the event. And as usual, this is an interactive event. So we want to hear your questions, and please use the chat function on the right-hand side of the screen to ask questions throughout today's show. We'll be taking audience questions after each section of a discussion, which today can be broken down into 4 challenges: part identification, use cases and the importance of digitalization, how to handle intellectual property, and finally, efforts in sustainability. So please don't hesitate to ask any questions you might have. Now, additive manufacturing has been described as transformational by BP's head of technology. And our readers will have seen news spanning investigations into understanding material properties, through to the application of proprietary AM processes developed for aerospace that are now in use in the oil and gas sector, as illustrated by a deal with Syntavia and Hauco recently. Now, many oil and gas companies were hesitant to adopt additive manufacturing due to the lack of standardized materials and processes. Now, there's a good reason to be cautious when you're working in a business like this, as these potentially 3D printed components are critical components that must withstand extreme conditions. Now, with advancements in material properties and string successes amongst other tightly regulated industries such as aerospace, automotive, and medical, these have validated 3D printing as a viable manufacturing method. So we're going to hear from a range of panelists today, and joining us from Italy is Valeria Tirelli, who is the CEO of Aidro Hydraulics and 3D Printing. Welcome, Valeria. Can you tell us a little bit about your company and your background in additive, please?
Hello, thank you, Mike, and hello, everybody. I'm Valeria Tirelli, I'm from Italy, and I'm working for Aidro, Hydraulics and 3D Printing. The company was founded by my father almost 40 years ago, working in the mechanical sector, and in particular in hydraulics, so hydraulics, valve, and manifold. And a few years ago, we were amazed by the potentiality of additive manufacturing. So we decided to invest in this technology to create our own department, in particular metal additive manufacturing. So we work with laser power bed fusion technology. And we start to create and redesign a lot of components that have a lot of big advantage compared to the conventional parts. And I'm really happy to be here and share my experience with you.
I'm glad you could join us. Also, I'd like to welcome Omar Abuhabaya, who is CEO of Shackled 3D. Good afternoon, Omar. Thank you very much for joining us today.
Good afternoon. Hi, everybody, and thank you for having me, Michael. My name is Omar Abuhabaya. I'm the founder and CEO of Shackled 3D Printing Services. We are based in Saudi Arabia, and I'm coming from an oil and gas background with more than 7 years of experience in operation and consultancy services.
Excellent. Thank you very much for taking time to join us. And completing today's expert panel, we have Ole-Bjørn Ellingsen, who is a materials engineer at DNVGL, a company of almost 15,000 employees, providing services across sectors including maritime, renewable energy, and oil and gas. So welcome to the show. Can you tell us a little bit about your work, please?
Thank you very much, and good afternoon, everyone. My name is Ole-Bjørn Mo, and I work in DNVGL. We are a global assurance company, working, as you said, mainly in the maritime and energy and oil and gas industries. we do a range of services, but I like to condense it to say that we mostly do third-party services, inspection, testing, verification, qualification, and also development of standards. My role in this company is materials engineer, and I do what I can to create some trust in additive manufacturing for the oil and gas business to enable or increase the adoption of this technology.
Marvelous. And we'll definitely be getting back to the standards a little bit later. So thank you again for joining us, and thank you to everyone who's tuned in today as well. And without further ado, we're going to get straight into the first challenge here in the oil and gas sector. It's not unique to the oil and gas sector, but certainly part identification can be a challenge. And I think maybe, Ole-Bjørn, perhaps you could tell us a little bit about what part identification is and why is this an issue we need to think about?
Yeah, as you said, this is not unique to the oil and gas business, of course, but it's important. It's about finding out what parts make sense to print and what parts should we not, spend our efforts on. And it's very important for additive manufacturing, because if you look at the manufacturing cost alone, then additive manufacturing might not look so interesting. But if you take the broader perspective of looking at the history of the part and looking at everything that is behind its life, then it might be very interesting. So, for example, the costs associated with long lead time for forgings, for example, what kind of costs are there hiding in the background of that long lead time? Does that long lead time lead to downtime of your operations? Then suddenly, if you're able to deliver a part in a shorter time frame, then that becomes a very interesting use case. And also with regards to spare parts, which we're going to talk more about today, how many spare parts do you have in your physical warehouse because of the lead time involved in those parts? So you want to make sure you have them on stock and don't need to wait several months maybe to be able to add them to your operations in case of a failure or downtime. Yeah. So it's a broad perspective.
Yeah, it sounds broad, but absolutely crucial. And Omar, I'm really interested to learn a bit about your experience as an end user company and how you're applying AM and how that links into part identification. Perhaps you could just talk us through a little bit of the work at Shackled 3D in your experience, please.
Yeah. So the oil and gas sector represents a certain level of challenges in order to implement the digital transformation program. And we've seen it, I've seen it throughout my experience in Saudi Aramco, especially when we adapted the advanced manufacturing, additive, AI, you name it, because of most of oil and gas facilities operates under a very harsh operational condition with limited conductivity, especially with remote areas offshore and inshore. And before we looked at identification, we started to lay out and establish the infrastructure of additive, be it in standardization and qualification, to be able to digitize and produce parts with AM solution. And there is a challenge here, since the vast majority of oil and gas products in upstream and downstream engineered and produced per order unit of 1, 2, or even 5. So we have to think about the automation and drive AM solution, where we can't depend on predicting a part or predicting configuration or things that we can automate for scale. We have to think about flexibility, and we have to think where to apply this technology to generate a return versus just to apply it because it's a great technology. We should be very practical about using the technology and very specific on how to create the change and transformation. And I have a slide here that can show and represent how is the identification is happening in oil and gas. So there are 3 main sources. Okay, can you see the slides?
Yes, I can see it.
Okay, so there are three main sources of part identification, especially from the end user perspective. We're looking at defective parts that are obsolete and the suppliers are out of the market, or we look at the high value commodity that can increase performance and brings reliability to operation. The third item is the innovative ideas, innovative solutions that the operating facilities can come up with and prototype and deploy immediately. Once the part identification is happening, we look at the digitalization perspective, where we scan these parts and have it in a CAD software, or we can design it from scratch if it's an idea or an invention. Also, we look at the design optimization. We can apply generative design or optimize the design to be cost effective, and then we prototype these ideas with the normal desktop machineries to visualize and sense the product before deployment, and finally we look at the AM fabrication of non-metallic commodity to be deployed and implemented in the field, and finally we digitize this part at the digital inventory to be produced on demand.
Marvelous. Okay, so it's quite a lengthy chain there, really, of a lot of activity going on. Valeria, I'm interested to hear how Aidro helps in this process, and what your approach is at your company.
Yes, indeed, we are a helper. We are helping the company to develop the digitalization and introduce additive manufacturing as a good technology to find the good solution for different problems. As I said before, we started from hydraulics, and now also we work for oil and gas and other sector, bringing our experience from traditional mechanicals and fluidodynamics to the innovative 3D printing. And we especially work with the manufacturer. I have a very good example to show you, because it's the example of a valve manufacturer. And I think you can see the slide.
Yes, yes.
Yes, perfect. And so starting from the current inventory, what is really important is to analyze all the parts and identify which component can benefit from 3D printing. You see a typical ball valve here, very common in the oil and gas fields. And we have analyzed with the valve manufacturer which component can be redesigned and then 3D printing. We use laser power bed fusion technology, and we use a lot of different material from stainless steel or Inconel. And we have checked that all the mechanical properties of the 3D printed parts are at very high level. This is really important to guarantee the feasibility of the parts and to guarantee the quality of the parts. Because after a long process of control, like dimensional control, testing on the parts, the new parts that you can see at the bottom of the slides, so the new 3D printed parts are assembling in the traditional valve and are put on the fields. So this is a very good example in which some component of a big oil and gas system can be benefit of 3D printing, can be replaced with a very high level quality product, and at the end they can work like the normal and conventional parts. So this is, I think, can help the trust of the oil and gas company in the technology, because what is really important now is to show that the technology can work, can help, and can also be introduced without too much, say, fears about possible cracks or defects that can have this technology.
Excellent. So we'll get into that in a second, but just a reminder to everyone who's listening and watching, we'll be taking questions in each section. So if you do have any questions for this section, please do let us know in the chat, and we'll come to those in a few minutes. But so Ole-Bjørn, Valeria and Omar were both giving us some examples of the different ways their companies work there. Is there a standard process for identifying parts at the moment?
No, there are no standards describing this in the oil and gas business, at least. Although many of the steps could very on a high level be similar, it's very much up to the operation of the company that want to look into this. How do they run their maintenance? How do they run their repair and operations? Because that will tell you also where the value of AM is with regards to, at least with regards to the spare parts business case.
Yeah.
So it's very dependent on how that is run.
And one interesting thing we reported on back in March was the successful completion of a pair of joint innovation projects organized by your company, DNVGL. And also at the same time, you launched this digital warehouse joint innovation project. Can you tell us more about that, please?
Yes, certainly. I will try to share some slides as well here. Mm-hmm. So this is after a successful closure of one of the joint innovation programs that we ran for the oil and gas and the additive manufacturing industry, which resulted in a qualification standard. We launched this digital warehouse JIP. This you can see the members on the left-hand side here. It's 17 companies with great knowledge in additive manufacturing and oil and gas, who are cooperating in making a framework for how the new supply chain may look like. So I've tried to visualize this by a circular supply chain, because this is going to be more flexible than the linear one that we are used to seeing. We're going to have a lot of different OEMs who store their parts in digital warehouses, maybe their own warehouses, maybe a third party's, and then part details might be sent to an on-demand manufacturer located somewhere else and close to the operation of the end user in the middle. So that is it's going to be really interesting. We are several months into this project now and in the midst of discussion. Mm-hmm. And it's going to be really interesting, because the business case here is really huge. It's the operators have immense warehouses where physical spare parts are stored, and it's not all of those spare parts that are needed. Frankly, it's very few spare parts that are continuously needed, and they are manufactured anyway and stored just in case. But what if we are able to make them just in time instead of storing them? And that can only happen if we're able to create a reliable and effective supply chain with rules decided responsibilities between the parties, so that we are able to shorten the lead time, so that you can be sure to get the right part and within the right time. And this is just it's a lot of questions that we need to answer, and these are just a few of them. So how do you ensure that the selected manufacturer at the location close to your operation has the capacity to print it when you need it? How do you ensure that the right version of that the part is printed? How do you define the print readiness of a part? I mean, you have to upload something that is ready to go, and not start the discussion of material selection or invoicing terms, for example. So all of this, it's a broad topic, but it's an interesting project and a lot of good discussion.
Yeah, and speaking of questions, we have quite a few coming in. So let's kick off with Mohammed Youssef, who is asking, how do you pick the parts to be 3D printed? Now, who would like to tackle that question? How do you pick a part to be 3D printed? Obviously, not everything is going to be suitable. Yeah, Omar.
Yeah, I can answer that question. So So there are certain requirements that you need to identify before proceeding with 3D printing solution. You need to know what problem or what gap you're trying to bridge using the technology. Are you trying to enhance performance? Are you trying to shorten the lead time? Are you trying to prototype an innovative solution to sense and feel before mass production? After once the gap is identified, you can immediately tackle the 3D printing aspect of production.
Okay, excellent. We've got another question as well from Brian Crossy, so I think we probably should answer that question. Is one of the three types of parts innovation aftermarket high value in a particular focus at the moment? It seems to Brian that the 3D printing news is focused on aftermarket at the moment, but is that correct, do you think, or is innovation high value aftermarket? Which one is the current focus here?
Well, I can tell you my experience because, as Brian say, aftermarket is for sure one of the main focus because people see a lot of possible, cost saving in these topics. But another point that I'm really happy to say, that is the possibility to redesign parts, rethink parts, and create a new generation of innovative parts. It is more, it's harder because it takes more time to design and to get approved for a new parts. But in this case, we can really have the best of the benefit of 3D printing because we can have lighter component, better performance. We can also have a component which require less energy, so we can save CO2 emission, meaning use less energy to produce it. So I think that for the future, more and more we will see innovative parts made with 3D printing, also in the oil and gas.
Excellent. So I'm aware that we do have some unanswered questions in the chat, and don't worry, we will come back to those a bit later on. I want to make sure we stick to our schedule though, and we do get through everything today that we've got planned. So we're going to move on now to the next stage, which is looking at some use cases. And I think this is going to bring out the answers to some of the questions I'm seeing cropping up. So we're going to look at some actual sort of real world use cases and how things are being used in the oil and gas sector using AM. So Omar, perhaps you could show us some of the work that you've been involved with, please. 'Cause I'd like to see just how components are getting made with additive.
Okay, so a digital inventory can help a lot in the scheduled shutdown. So every single plant or refinery in oil and gas industry is scheduled for a shutdown. Sometime they do it every 5 or 4 years, and once they do that, they unlock the machineries and equipment, and they realize lots of failures inside that equipment to be replaced and maintained. And the digital inventory can help a lot to save millions and millions of dollars daily if the parts are digitized and can be produced on demand. So you're talking about eliminating the extended shutdown scope, which can cost millions, and the high cost of inspection methods, and also it can reduce the inventory cost. I also have a slide here that I would like to showcase that shows some use cases that have been done and deployed in oil and gas industry. Okay. So once the part is reverse engineered and digitized and ready for production, here's some examples, some real life examples that have been deployed in the field and reduced the lead time of production and enhanced the performance. For example, in the left hand side we have this valve with sophisticated passages that allows the fluid to reduce its velocity, to reduce erosion, and once the decommissioning of the valve is completed, you'll find it safe and you can operate it back again just fine. So these are some of the few examples that are being deployed, and it's really famous. It's spreading up at a high scale, such as the inducer, the impeller, and the turbine plates.
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
So these are real sort of serious critical sort of components you're actually talking about.
Yeah.
Yeah. Valeria, do you have some examples you can show us of how Aidro are working here?
Yes, I have two examples. The first one was made during the first joint industry project last year. This is a crank disc made for Kongsberg, so for vessels and drilling vessels. And the idea was to test if 3D printing can produce in a very fast way a part that can be replaced in an old system, in particular in this case in an old thruster. We were surprised by the results because we were able to print it only in 1 week instead of almost 8 to 10 weeks of the conventional manufacturing. And this was a very good example because the part was made in Inconel, so it is quite heavy. But it generates the possibility to repair the old system in a very fast way. And the fact that we printed the part, we have also the digital file. So we can think for the future to put in the stock only a digital file instead of physical parts. And this means a lot of cost saving and, of course, reduction of parts in the warehouse. So this is a very good example of oil and gas parts. And I have another part that I have to tell you that this case is the copy of one-to-one of the conventional part. So in this case, there is no redesign. The aim was only to replace the conventional part. Why I have a good example of a part that was redesigned. This is an hydraulic manifold, hydraulic valve. In this case, the body of the valve is made in 3D printing in stainless steel 316L. And this is the idea to have the file in the stock, so not the real parts, and have on-demand parts. So when we receive an inquiry from the customer, we are able to produce it in a very fast way and to reply to the customer. So we don't have any minimum batch of production, so we save a lot of money, so we can avoid to have a lot of money in the stock. And then again, we are ready to reply to our customers in a very fast way. So this is our two good examples of real parts. Both parts are working, were machined and assembled in the final parts. So I can tell you that these parts, so the crank disc and the valve, are already in function. So they are put in the system and everything is working fine. So this is a very good and positive answer to the question if 3D printing can produce functional parts and guarantee a very high quality of material.
Mm-hmm. And hopefully that should answer Carmela's question in the chat, who's asked, have you evaluated the performance of these valves installed on offshore platforms?
This is a good question, because before to install in a platform, there are a lot of requirements, especially on the certification point of view. So we are now working on this project, but I can tell you that there are no official parts installed at the moment. Also because there are many institutes working on this part, like American Petroleum Institute and also other institutes. What is really important to say is that we need to create confidence and trust in this technology.
Mm-hmm. Ole-Bjørn, perhaps can you show us anything of what your companies have been up to, please?
Yeah, and that's a good note to show it with as well, because I have a part that really increased some of the trust for my sake, at least in AM. Mm-hmm. I'll show you this one here. This here is a nozzle holder. It's manufactured for Equinor. They saw that they need this part for their boats offshore. And they saw that this part is nowhere to be be found. It's obsolete. So they contacted Siemens and asked them to reverse engineer this part and make it for them. And so they did, and then they sent it to us, and we pressure tested it to qualify it, and it sustained several times what it needed to sustain. And I think that is it's quite. And I have it here as well. So it's, I think this is a brilliant example, because not only did it sustain a very, very high pressure, much more than it had to withstand for operation, but it also shows the case of obsolescence of parts, where you make them available through the reverse engineering, agile manufacturing due to additive manufacturing. And also to top it all off, this was, it's improved design because of internal challenge. And as the last step, it was delivered offshore by means of a drone. So it's I like this example.
So we're really living in the future there, yeah. And I think this kind of touches on a question we've got from Shamjif Sentanaka, apologies for my pronunciation there, who's asking if the 3D printed parts can withstand the same pressure of the original parts, and also about the lifespan of these AM components. Can you comment on that at all?
Sorry.
Go ahead.
No, I can say yes, of course, because we already tested, for example, the valve that I showed before at around 300 bar. What is really important is to start to think that the 3D printer parts are very similar to the conventional parts, and to make a lot of tests in the conventional test bench can prove that the parts can work in the normal way. So I think that if the design is well made and the printing also has followed all the procedure and the quality assurance, at the end the part can work as the conventional, or even if better in some cases.
Yeah, and we have a question which I think links very much to that, where Hamid Al-Matari is asking, how do you ensure that the part properties meet the standards in the way that the traditional parts made from traditional methods do? How do you accomplish that? Is it a question of performing the same tests?
It's a combination, I guess. So that is part of what we made during the last joint industry project, where Aidro also was part. We developed this quality assurance scheme, where you not only look at the part, but you also need to assure the process. So you need to ensure that the parameters that you use for the machine is qualified, and that they result in properties that you intend, that the feedstock is according to specifications, that but also the part, if it's of higher criticality, then you might, depending on the design, you might have some differences in properties depending on how the part is shaped. So you need to do some extra steps there. And so this is developed in cooperation with Aidro and 19 other companies.
Right. So I think we're starting to talk about some of these topics. This might be a good time to get into our next challenge, which is intellectual property. And the reason I'm saying this is we're talking about these critical components. Well, where does responsibility lie for these? Where does the liability lie? Also, what about the commercial benefits? And I suppose when we're starting to talk about digitization of components, what about changing business models, and how the barriers between companies might sort of be different than if you're just ordering in a completed component every time? So let's get into some of this straight away. And perhaps Valeria, if you could tell us about the current situation, about how you manage IP at Aidro between your business partners.
It's a very good question. Very hard to reply. Is a good topic, because in every different case we define with the end customer about the IP, so the intellectual properties, because in some cases the end users already have the IP of the parts, and this is also the best situation, because in this case, we are able to redesign the part, make the 3D printing, and then give the parts to the end users, and keep the IP at the moment. But in many, many other cases, the IP is not in the end user's hands, is more, in most of the case, on the component manufacturer. For example, a valve manufacturer has the IP of the parts. In this case, it's really important to cooperate with the whole supply chain and also cooperate with the component manufacturer, because at the end they have the, say, conventional parts, they have the IP, and it's important to define a good collaboration all together, because to replace a conventional part with a 3D printed parts, it's also necessary to know a lot of characteristics and features of the conventional parts. So in this case, the best is to share the IP or discuss with the end users and the original component manufacturer, which is the best solution. But in any case, it's not an easy topic.
Yeah, and it's potentially, I suppose, well, what can go wrong here? Ole-Bjørn, what are the pitfalls? What do people need to be aware of when they're dealing with IP?
Yeah, with example of this nozzle this is an obsolete part, and that means you can you saw the need for it. Equinor really needed this part, and they went ahead to reverse engineer it and produce it. And sometimes the business case is, it's there, it's non-disputable, and you just need to manufacture it. But sometimes it's not an obsolete part, and that might, it might be tempting to go ahead anyway and install that small component in a bigger machinery to make that go again. But what then? Yeah, where's the liability then if something goes wrong with the entire machinery? Is the warranty from the OEM still valid? So these are gray areas, I'd say. And also, if you're making the same part with a new manufacturing method, sometimes the IP is related to the way you're manufacturing it. So that might, for some OEMs, be outside of their IP. So, yeah, there are definitely some gray areas there.
Yes, and I wonder, Omar, maybe you can sort of shed a bit more light onto this from your perspective.
Yeah, I agree with Valeria. The end user does not have the IP in their hand most of the time. But they tend to focus on obsolete commodities and IP not restricted products, where they can outsource to an engineering firm or a service provider to reverse engineer and 3D print these parts again. And that would be there will be no restriction in IP on that sense. And also there's a lot of opportunities when it comes to the innovative products that the end users is inventing and creating, and they can outsource to a 3D printing firm to 3D print these parts. And some of the time we see some collaboration with OEM and the end user to localize the manufacturing process. So they see visibility in using 3D printing, and they connect service provider to the OEM to create a solution that serves all entities.
So, I mean, as much as a certain company may have wanted to believe us to believe that 3D printing was as simple as pressing a button, we all probably know that that's maybe not quite the case. And obviously, your process parameters and your know-how of your engineers really sort of do massively contribute to the success of a project. So, how much of that know-how does that, and that those parameters, how much does that make its way into the IP of a product? If anyone wants to tackle that one, it might be a bit of a big question.
I believe it's crucial since the printing know-how is being established recently. You have lots of standardization bodies trying to figure out what are the parameters and the requirements needed to validate and qualify commodities. So it's quite of a challenge, and we see some testing and trial and error to come up with the right parameters to produce a product.
Okay, and you mentioned standardization there. Perhaps Ole-Bjørn, could you tell us a bit more about how standardization links in with IP policy? Is there any standardization?
The IP and the handling of IP is very much up to regulations and also business models for different companies. So I think it's difficult to standardize that. But it will be very interesting to see how this develops also going forward with regards to distributed manufacturing, for example. Some OEMs might want to keep their IP very closely linked to themselves and remain in control and have the control of the whole supply chain with selected manufacturers. And some might want to take the leap also to really benefit from the distributed on-demand manufacturing with different manufacturers at different locations, maybe relying on third-party qualifications of these manufacturing facilities. And that requires some different views on the IP, how to handle that challenge.
We've got a question here from Abdullah Garamar, who's I think we've addressed part of the question about intellectual property being a concern for AM, but maybe we could take the other part of the question here: piracy, and I suppose counterfeiting. Is that somehow linked in here, and is that a concern for the sector?
Yes, probably yes. Is a good point. I can tell you the experience from the motorsport that I have, because in some cases the main motorsport and racing car producer, they use external company to produce 3D printing parts, and in some cases they send the file to these companies, and but the file has some encrypt some security. For example, how many parts you can print it, the parameter that you can use it. So there are many software that can help now to have a secure and to avoid any piracy on the intellectual properties of the files. For sure, also in the oil and gas, these topics will be more and more interesting in the future when we will start to design new parts with additive manufacturing. Because I think that when we replace one-to-one, so we copy the existing part, the conventional parts, at the end is a kind of reverse engineering or replacement. But for new and innovative parts that can, for example, have installed some sensor or some feature to have a better performance, in this case, it's really important to protect the digital file of the 3D printing parts.
Indeed. And this week, I think one of my journalists interviewed Sharon Flank from a company called Infotrack, who I don't know if you know them, but they are very much focused on this. And they, rather than having a barcode or a QR code, which could easily be sort of removed on the surface, they actually embed things beneath the surface and create a sort of digital watermark, which can then be sort of detected at all the stages where that component's being sort of delivered or utilized to try to combat this, what could be a potentially large problem at some point. Anyway, let's get into our next sort of challenge here, which is one which is very interesting to me, and I'm really sort of keen to hear more about what your perspectives are on this. So this is sustainability, and in the oil and gas industry, obviously a big topic as it is globally, but here because we're talking about inventory. So what do we do about old inventory? What's the life cycle impact of making a product by additive manufacturing? So I'd like to really sort of try to get into this a little bit. And I know we were talking earlier, Valeria, and you mentioned that you have some interesting work around recycling conventional parts. So perhaps you could tell us about these.
Yes, thank you. I'm really happy to share my feeling, my thoughts about sustainability, also in the oil and gas or in mechanical sector in general, and to use additive manufacturing to boost the sustainability also in the industry. I have two good examples. The first one, as you can see, let's have a look at the parts. So you see the conventional manifolds. So it's the first on your left. This was made by conventional manufacturing, casting and machining. We have done this kind of exercise. So we 3D printed the same parts using laser power bed fusion technology, but just copy one-to-one the same shape. In this case, we already have some reduction in terms of energy consumption and in terms of CO2 emission. You can see on the left the graphic that show the reduction of CO2 emission calculated in terms of global warming potential. So also the first example, so is the 3D printed part copied one-to-one, already have a good CO2 emission saving, but what is really amazing is the third part is completely redesigned. So the same function of the hydraulic manifolds is made now in only one part, because the original manifold was an assembly of 4 components. And thanks to the design for additive manufacturing, we were able to have just one part. So we save the assembling time and assembling cost. We reduced the weight of 60% compared to the conventional manifolds. And in terms of CO2 emission, we reduce it about 80%. This is really amazing. This is a study, so probably I can tell you that it is not perfect. It's just the first exercise we have done in collaboration with Equinor and with the Norway University. But it's really an amazing result. So we can say that with 3D printing, taking into account all the elements involved in the process, so starting from the powder production to the post-processing, we can really have sustainable parts compared to the conventional. So this is a very good example. I can say that it's not maybe possible for every component, but it's a good way to think that also 3D printing can improve the sustainability of the parts. And I have another very good case to show you. It's a new project. So my company is working with these other partners to create a circular economy ecosystem. The project was made by Fenice, an Italian startup, with the idea to recycle the old spare parts or the old stock and the parts that are coming from the decommissioning of the oil and gas platform, to use this part as raw material for the production of the powder, metal powder, for additive manufacturing. You know, the process is an atomization of the component, the scrap material. The idea is to produce powder for different additive manufacturing technology and to use this powder to make new parts. Of course, the main point is to redesign the parts, so to take the benefit of additive manufacturing. And at the end, with the new process, with the 3D printing, we will be able to have new parts, probably lighter and with less CO2 emission included in the process, and to use again this part in the fields. So this is a very ambitious project. We are just starting on this, but I think it's a very good approach for the future. So to think how to improve the sustainability in the industries and how much additive manufacturing can be used to improve this good approach compared to the conventional manufacturing.
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned the circular economy there, because I've seen some interesting work from a few companies, and one of them was a US company called Mollyworks. I don't know if you've come across them, but they are, again, they're taking scrap and bringing that back into the back into use by sort of by atomizing it, turning it back into powder. Yes, so fascinating work. Omar, I understand you've also been doing some interesting work in this area. but around environmental monitoring. Can you maybe just talk us through this, please?
Yes. So in oil and gas facility, we have to collect samples from the retained seawater, and this sample collection, it has to be done effectively and safely for the operator. So we've created this SLA printed sample collector to dive deep into the water and collect a sample from a different layers of the sandpits. And these samples then tested and evaluated to ensure no contamination of hydrocarbon. And it's been deployed, tested, and validated in the field as we speak.
Mm-hmm.
And this is one of our successful deployment of AM in Saudi Aramco.
So what was the advantage of using AM here?
So we have this part that can be, the size of that part can be adjusted based on the applications. So in some bits we have different diameters of that opening, and we have to adjust the dimension of the device based on the given requirements, and now it's been digitized and adjusted manually in a timely manner and produced on demand using SLA technology.
Okay, excellent. And I think someone was asking earlier about was it just metals in oil and gas, and this obviously illustrates it's not just metals. Polymers also have a role.
Of course.
Yeah.
Of course. Yeah.
Fantastic. Okay, let's Ole-Bjørn, perhaps you could tell us a bit more about the digital warehouse and specifically how that helps with sustainability here.
Yeah, unfortunately, in many ways, the best thing for the environment and sustainability is to avoid producing parts. Even though the design of and the products that is possible with additive manufacturing are amazing, then they're still using energy and still emitting CO2. And I recently spoke to an operator, and he told me that they have a spare part inventory of 3 billion euros worth, and 85% of that spare part inventory is never used. And that's a huge amount of metal and materials in general. So if we're successful in utilizing additive manufacturing and digital warehousing in a manner that reduces the lead time significantly, so that instead of storing physical parts just in case, we can produce just in time, then I think the sustainable and environmental benefit from that will be immense, and also the cost savings.
Excellent. Okay, we've got a lot of questions, so I'm going to sort of rush along a little bit. But one here from Loke Kudert. Have you already started to qualify AM parts made with recycled powder, and with which materials?
Good question. We already started the project, so I can tell you that there is no already qualified parts. But the idea is to make all the process in accord to the actual standard. So we will follow, for example, the guideline made, for example, by DNVGL, by the one that are in progress from API, so American Petroleum Institute. So we will take care about all the existing standard, also ASTM, for example. Mm-hmm. But what is sure is that already, for example, my company, we have our internal quality management system, and we have procedure to qualify all the phases. As said before by Ole-Bjørn, we qualify the raw material, the machine, the process, the operators also. So it's clear that we have to take care about all the different phases during the process. But I hope that we will be ready with the other partners of the ecosystems that are Valland and Valvision companies. And the aim is to have the first pilot case ready for the early next year, so at the beginning of 2021.
Okay, excellent. And we have another question here from Sunil Kashyap, who asks, there'll be some parts which could be metal that are replaced with plastics. In those cases, how does liability and how do warranties work?
So, yeah. So when you we looked at many applications to replace metal parts, and it's been of a huge initiative within Saudi Aramco to replace metallic commodities with non-metallic. We looked at piping systems and clamps and many other products. The reliability of the non-metallic or polymer-based parts are extremely, in some cases, are extremely higher than metal. Especially when you talk about the elimination of corrosion, erosion, and the sustainability. And there are polymer-based materials such as PEEK and Ultim that can withstand a very high temperature, very high pressure. And we've seen it deployed in so many use cases.
Thank you. Would you like to add anything to that, Ole?
No, I think that only adding that of course, if you're replacing something that has any IP, then that you have to look into that. But if it's a generic part or an obsolete part, then the operator might go ahead, but then there's a risk involved, of course, and they really need to look into why was metal chosen in the first place. Maybe it was the strength, or maybe it was the temperature properties.
Okay, all right. You will see a little banner I've just put up there for the next event that's coming up. So I'll give you some more information on that in a second. But we've really heard here that AM's having when you mentioned cutting the lead time from 8 weeks to 1 week, and then Omar, you were saying, well, it's millions of dollars a day in here. So these are big numbers that AM's able to address. So I think it's been some very interesting insights into the world of oil and gas, and into the way that we're moving from this physical to this digital warehouse. But I'd like to know from our guests today, what are your thoughts about the future? What's the next big thing that we've got to sort of tackle here?
So I believe in the identification of parts can be done in an automated process, where you can use AI solution to identify parts, and you can tell from the economical perspective which part is feasible and which part is not. And that's where I see, especially in the digital inventory, that's where I see the growth is happening, and the quick adoption of parts is the quick identification of parts that are 3D printable and feasible in terms of cost perspective.
Excellent. How about you, Valeria?
Yes, from my point of view, I think that all the supply chain will have a benefit of using additive manufacturing. But of course, at the beginning, they need to test it, make some trial, and have a trust, create a trust in the technology. So only at the end, after, like say, an experimental period, the people can trust the technology and are ready to use it. Of course, we, for example, as a small company, we are helping and supporting the big company in the additive manufacturing journey, because it's really important to go deeper in the technical side, in the mechanical properties, in the technology. So only at the end, I can say that all the supply chain will have a big benefit of using additive manufacturing.
Excellent. Ole-Bjørn, perhaps you could give us your final thoughts, please.
Yeah, my thoughts is also that we need to continue learning or teaching also others in the oil and gas industry, because I still meet representatives in the industry who are surprised when they hear that metal printing is possible. So it's not only about the lack of trust in the technology. It's also about the lack of knowledge about the possibilities. So I think if we're managing to teach a bit more about what is possible, and also create the trust, have use cases that says this is really possible, then I think this will really be applicable in the industry.
Great. Well, hopefully today's gone a little bit towards sharing some of that knowledge with with each other. And I know also at this time it's very difficult. We're not going to the trade shows. We're not seeing each other at these events like we normally would. So it's also nice to be able to see a few people from the AM world and in the chat and also here as well. It's very good. But we are sort of running out of time. So I'm just going to sort of give you everyone who's attended, thank you very much for joining us. We really appreciate all the great questions you've asked. If you do have any questions we didn't address, please feel free to contact Free Your Mind via the sort of registration page, and they'll be able to redirect your questions to the appropriate person. There's also more information here I've posted in the chat about that JIP we were discussing as well, and Ole-Bjørn was giving us great details. Thank you again to our guests today. So thank you, Omar. Thank you, Valeria. Thank you, Ole-Bjørn. Really appreciate you taking time out of your day to join us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you to the audience for attending. And just one last thing to mention before we wrap up. You'll see the next event will be on the 30th of October, and this will be talking about justifying the costs for additive manufacturing. So if you'd like to sign up to that, there should be a link on your screen now. Okay, so I'm Michael Petch, and this was the Friday Friday talk show. Thank you for joining us, and see you in the next one. Goodbye, everyone.
Goodbye. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you.